The underworld for every student is their own psyche, getting them to go deep down inside themselves.
Welcome to the Science of Creativity, your home for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Sawyer. Today's episode is about how art is made and how people learn to make it. My guest is Kit White, a New York painter who had his first solo exhibition in 1977. In the 1990s, he started teaching painting at Pratt Institute in New York City. It's one of the top schools for art, design, and architecture. We're going to talk about his book. It's the international bestseller, 101 Things to Learn in Art School. This is a conversation about how art is made and how people grow to become artists. Kit, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me.
You've been a professor of painting at Pratt Institute in New York for over 20 years, and you have a lot of experience. You've written a book about it, 101 Things to Learn in Art School. But I wanted you to go back and tell us, do you remember the first time that you taught in art school? Could you tell us about that first time?
Sure, I remember it very clearly because I started teaching relatively late. I was in my 40s already. I had 20 odd years in studio practice, and I actually decided to start teaching out of a certain need to go back to investigating those initial questions which we ask ourselves, the kind of questions that people stop asking after they've been in the studio for 20 years. As I walked into the classroom for the very first time, and this was an undergraduate class in color theory, I looked around the room at all of these eager young faces, and the first question that popped into my mind was, what the hell do I have to say to them that's going to be of any significance? And then I had to remind myself instantly that you've been doing this for 20-some years, and you know all sorts of things that they don't. So the issue immediately was, okay, how do I approach this? How do I get to the information that is going to help them understand what they're doing here and not just telling them, but leading them into the information. So the first day was a combination of fear and interest.
Oh, that's interesting. And with creative practice, I think you're right. You can't just lecture at someone and tell them how to be creative, or you can't lecture at someone and tell them how to paint. So you mentioned guiding them. What do you mean by that?
I will say most of my experience was teaching either seniors or graduate students. And I always thought of it as sort of Virgil taking Dante into the underworld. Not every student is a Dante and will produce the Divine Comedy, but they are all there to be eager observers. I saw my role as a teacher as basically putting in front of them things for them to observe, to see, and to absorb. And then, the underworld for every student is their own psyche, getting them to go deep down inside themselves and find out what it is that they have to say. That is the biggest role, I think, that teachers in art schools have. And it's a tricky role because sometimes it means treading in places that people don't want to go. Sometimes the teachers are fearful to go there. Sometimes the students are fearful to look at those parts of themselves. But those are the things that ultimately are the spark that create the images, the performances, whatever it is they're doing. You have to locate that place, and they have to locate it, and you have to help them get there.
Do you find that students sometimes don't know what it is that they have to say? I mean, a lot of students come in and they have goals of social justice or the environment. That might be the message they want to communicate, but sometimes they may have something else inside and they don't know it yet. Is that right?
I think most of the time they don't know it. And the students who think they know it, they have to get that out of the way, first of all, because the pressure of the thing inside that wants to get out is not necessarily something that they yet know. And if they believe that they know, then that's an impediment. And I time and time again, I would see someone saying, well, this is what I want to say. But when you talk to them and when you look at what they were doing, you realize that the subject they had chosen for themselves wasn't at all the thing that really formed their core, and they could do nothing but illustrate that idea because it wasn't coming from a place of passion or a place of need.
Could you give an example of a student that went through this experience?
Yes, one in particular who was a graduate student. She was Canadian. She came into graduate school with all sorts of talents, technical talents. She had a really marvelous understanding of what paint can do, and she had all kinds of technical prowess. But she couldn't locate what she wanted to do with all that technical expertise. So she kept trying different things, and she was approaching it thematically. She would get an idea, and then she would try to apply her technical gifts to that idea. And it just didn't take. And she went time and time again and couldn't find the thing she wanted to say. So I said to her, well, I'm going to leave you alone in your studio for a little while. We went back. The class would travel from studio to do critiques. And we went into her studio one day, and there were these marvelous, mysterious little paintings. It was clear that she was just beginning to find something. And so I didn't want to talk about them. And I told the class, let's leave her alone. After a while, she developed really quite a few of these, and they were marvelous paintings. Then one day we went into her studio, and all those marvelous little paintings were gone. And in its place were all of these little landscapes that were really very banal. I said, well, what's happened here? What's going on? She said, well, I'm about to graduate, and I really don't want to go out into the world and make a lot of things that the rest of the world won't understand and won't support. So I thought I would make something that people could relate to and want to buy. And I turned to her and I said, do you like to travel? And she said, yes, I love to travel. She said, after painting, it's my great passion. I said, well, why do you like to travel? She said, because I like to see things I've never seen before. And the whole class erupted in laughter. And she looked at me and she said, oh, I get it. And she went back to making these little paintings, which came from some place of, I wouldn't say fantasy in herself, but some sense that with her materials, she could make a place and a space that didn't exist and no one had seen before, and she hadn't seen it before. And when she went fully back into that place, she then produced one of the most beautiful thesis shows I'd ever seen.
An incredible story. It reminds me of an MFA student that I interviewed who told me she entered the program wanting to talk about consumerism, a social critique of consumerism. And then she gradually discovered through working that what she really was talking about was the comfort of home, domesticity. And her MFA thesis ended up being about milk and cooking and motherhood. And she just realized that consumerism wasn't really it for her, but she had to go through the process of working with, and I think it really was working with materials and trying to take that idea of consumerism and make it happen in an object, and it just wasn't working.
Yeah, I think that for a lot of students, there's a great confusion between illustration and something else, an image that belongs unto itself. I used to spend a lot of time talking to my students about this problem. I said, anytime you make an image and that image is subordinate to the idea as opposed to being the idea, then you're illustrating. Then you're just making something that's beholden to something else. I think that's one of the problems of students thinking thematically, of thinking that they want to deal with this issue. Then they start approaching it about making images that are about an idea, but the images never become the primary mode of communication. I think that's one of the reasons why process and the discovery of accident, which you mentioned in your writing, I think that's one of the reasons it's so important, because those things that come out that you discover are things that are unto themselves. They aren't beholden to anything else to give them meaning and for you to understand them. I think that is one of the great challenges with students now, is to get them beyond that place where they're trying to illustrate an idea. Because we live in a culture that is so image saturated. And those images all carry some kind of an agenda. Usually it's a consumerist agenda, an advertising agenda, something that has a coercive underbelly to it. And it's very hard to get away from that. And students often think that if they use images, if they appropriate things, that somehow they can make them their own. But they have to get rid of that agenda that's there for the image initially before they can superimpose their own. That takes a lot of thinking, and it takes a lot of observation. It takes a lot of digging into themselves to understand what their own initial reaction is to those things that they've encountered and then attempted to appropriate.
It's interesting that we're talking about teaching in art school, and you haven't said anything about, the technique of painting, like holding a brush, and really what you've been talking about. It's a kind of personal transformation in how you see yourself and how you see working with material. So that seems very, elusive and intangible to teach. How do you teach something like that?
I think that this is where teaching becomes a personal project for every student. I don't think there is one shoe that fits all. Graduate school especially, and actually for seniors in a four-year art school like Pratt, where I taught, I do think that it is a matter of thinking, that you learn technique as you need it. Technique is a great gift that many people have great facility at drawing, for instance. It doesn't help them if what they have to say doesn't jive with the technique. And I really think that a lot of art school is learning to find the thing you need to say what you need to say. And that comes out of a lot of conversations, a lot of looking. It's not something that every student can get from a formula. And it's a very one-on-one experience. And I think that's where teaching is most effective.
It reminds me of something that is in your book. The book's called 101 Things to Learn in Art School. And just like the title says, there are 101 things, one on each page. And I purchased this book myself over 10 years ago, had a big influence on me and how I think about art school. So it seems like part of what we're talking about is something I think of as emergence, as the ideas and the meaning emerging from a process of working. And that's number 4 of the 101 things. It is art is the product of process. So what does that mean? How would you describe that process?
Well, process, of course, is a way of working, and it tends to be very individual for different students. It is something that it's, I guess, a mode of observation in a way, but your materials, if you know what your materials are, if you know what your technique is, then you employ those things to take you on a path of discovery. This goes back again to what I was talking about before, the idea of illustration versus autonomy. And that is that if you have just the vaguest idea of what you want to do, then you start a process of experimentation. And it is through experimentation that things emerge. There's a great quote of the architect Renzo Piano's where he says, art is very much like science in that it's a form of experimentation. And what we know from science is that most experiments fail. And you've talked about the issue of failure. It's a really important part of the act of discovery. But, people develop different kinds of processes. I mean, some people, if you're a performance artist, for instance, process is very different from if you're a painter. But I would broadly define process as one's mode of inquiry through the materials you use to make what you make.
And the process of inquiry sounds like it's not linear. A lot of the professors I interview, in undergraduate programs especially, they say that students come in thinking that the way to generate art is to have an idea and then to execute that idea. And the professors all tell me this results in bad art, and they have to teach the students to not start with an idea. Some of them will actually say that in the studio to their students. And yeah, so how do you teach that?
Well, this this becomes very complicated and has been complicated by the advent of conceptual work. And there is kind of an expectation now that there has to be an underlying concept to what one is doing. That is something that can be both good and bad for people, because this goes back again. I think what people were talking about, the other professors, is the idea that if you start with an idea, you then try to create an image for it, you end up with an illustration as opposed to something that is the primary mode of communication itself. How you go about getting people beyond that is, again, it tends to be very individual. If they're doing something, if they're too beholden to their concept, you have to call them out on it. You have to talk them through it. You have to say, what is it you're trying to get at here? And oftentimes, when students start to articulate what it is they're trying to get to, what they will tell you is not what they say they're trying to do. So you have to sort of get them to learn how to burrow into themselves. One thing that I would often do when we were doing critiques is I'd bring students into a room and I would say, okay, give me one word or give me two words. Don't give me a sentence. Don't try and be discursive about what you're looking at. Just give me a word that is a reaction to the thing you're seeing. And oftentimes, when they would give me two or three words, it would be completely opposite from what they would tell me if they were trying to actually sit in the class and be smart and be articulate. And I said, you have to trust those reactions more than you trust your thinking, because we all get stuck in modes of thinking. There are habitual ways of thinking that get in the way. In fact, almost all habits get in the way. So one of the first things you have to do is identify the habits and say, okay, let's not do it this way. Let's try to do it a way that we don't know. Let's try to think about it in a way that we don't know. And sometimes it means getting down to those very basic reactions that we have. Because I think that artwork operates on two different levels. One of them is conceptual, and one of them is catalytic. And the catalytic reaction is the truer reaction in many ways. That is the thing that you initially feel, your initial response. And I think that artwork does that. It causes a reaction in you, and you have to go with that reaction. And the work that is the most successful is the work in which there is a strong concept, but there is a catalyzing reaction that reinforces the concept, that is the concept, that isn't something separate. So bringing those two things together, the reaction and the idea, that is what you have to lead students toward finding. And it's not easy. It's not always easy to get them there. They first have to recognize their own reactions. And that's a tough place.
Right. When you say catalyst, you mean catalyst for something that's happening within them. It sounds like not necessarily just something you see in the work.
No, it is something within them. And I think that, if any of us walks through a museum, invariably there are going to be things that simply jump out at you, that cause a reaction in you, that draws you to it and makes you then participate in that image. And that reciprocal kind of reaction, that participation in the making of the image, that's the thing that you want to get to. And that's something that's very personal. It's why no two people react to an image exactly the same way. They tend to have very personal associations, very personal reactions, and that's what gives static images, especially their breadth and their relevance. And so finding that reaction is a critical first step, both as a viewer and a maker.
It reminds me of a graphic design class that I observed where one of the students was undergoing a critique, and the instructor was saying, there were eyeballs, eye images in pretty much all of his work throughout the semester. And the instructor was pointing this out. She said, you have eyes in all of your paintings, and we need to explore what's going on here. Why is that? The student had not noticed that there were so many eyes in the work.
Yeah.
So part of it is just calling it out, I guess, or
Sure.
just saying that it's there.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. Students often embed lots of information in their work that they're not conscious of. And some of it, if it's something that is habitual and isn't adding to the image, then you have to call it out so that it can be eliminated. And if it's something that they don't know it's there, and then you start to query them on what it's about, sometimes that's when conversations get very interesting.
So it seems like it could even be something personal, I guess I'd say, or psychological. I don't know if you want to avoid doing psychoanalysis in the studio, but how do you negotiate that? Some sort of boundaries, I suppose.
Yeah, those boundaries are often difficult to negotiate. And I think that in the last decade, they've become even more difficult in that people now can think of a question, a personal question, as an offense. So that area has become quite fraught in many ways. And I have often worried about that in the sense that if you can't have sometimes very deep personal conversations, you can't get to the thing that a student needs to get out. There's something that I think I have it in the book. I might be misremembering, but Walker Percy, the novelist, who was also a philosopher, had this comment he made. He defined the unconscious as that which we know or have experienced, but for which we do not have a name. So it's like having a library without a card catalog. If you don't have the name for something, you can't summon it into your conscious mind. But there are other things that will bring it up. A smell, a touch, a sight, a quality of light, something someone says. There are all of these things that bring things that are deeply embedded in our psyches to the surface. And that's one of those things that I refer to as the catalyzation. There are these things that can summon an experience without giving it a name, without verbalizing it. And I really think that this is what gives visualization its power, is that it reaches into the brain without having to go through the prefrontal cortex and be given an idea or something. It just reaches in and it grabs you. And there's nothing else that can do that. W.J.T. Mitchell, who's a wonderful writer who taught at the University of Chicago for a long time, talks about this. He talks about visual things as a language, as something that have their own syntax. It's a language that has ways of communicating that have nothing to do with our verbal capacity, have nothing to do with our conceptualization of ideas. It is a language that goes straight to us. It's almost an adrenaline-based messaging system. If you think of being out in the wild and a bear jumps out from behind a tree, your body knows what's happened before your brain has given a name to the fact that it's a bear. And I think that learning to harness this particular language and learning to harness this way of communicating is really what lies at the heart of visual art.
You're talking about teaching some very profound things. And as I'm listening, I'm thinking this must be the way you create work. It's your own practice. It's you're teaching the students. So is that true? Would you say this is something that you go through yourself when you're creating your work?
Yes, I would say so. But, like anyone who's been practicing for as long as I have, which is 40 some years now, you stop being conscious of certain things because over that time you develop a language of your own that you use to get at certain states of mind or certain states of emotion or certain ideas. And you stop being conscious of the language, but you're always still reacting to the language. So when I put a line down, I react to that line. And that conversation, and I used to always say to my students, this is not a monologue. It's not you always sort of saying things. This is about you having a conversation with what is developing at the end of your brush. And until you get to the point that it is a conversation, then you're missing something. I used to say to I'd go to a student's studio and I'd say, well, what's that painting telling you? And they would say, well, what do you mean? I say, that painting is telling you all sorts of things. Are you listening? And it would take them a long time to come around to the idea that there really is a conversation taking place, that the paint on the surface of that canvas really is telling them something about itself, about the image it's trying to make, about the image that you as the maker are trying to make. And I think that a lot of what being in art school is about is learning to have that conversation, because that's what you take out into your own practice with time, is to be able to be alone in the studio and to be having this dialogue with the thing that you're working on without the help of another person. It's just you and what you're doing. When they get to that point, then it's up to them. They're on their own.
That's number 31 in your book, by the way. It's one of the ones I wrote down to ask you about. And it's, I'll quote from your book: what happens in the studio should be a conversation, not a monologue.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And I firmly believe that. And that is certainly something that I carry into my own studio practice. When I work, I try to approach every single thing as if it's totally new. And I try to listen to what it's trying to tell me it wants to be. And that conversation, I think that probably a sane person would think that sounds like listening to voices or some kind of insanity, but it's really not. It really is just being in tune with the image that is unraveling before you. and knowing that that image is telling you what it wants to be. And if you're not listening, you can ruin it. And I've seen so many. My students used to make fun of me. I would walk into their studios and they would all in unison say, "Stop, don't do anything more." And because they would always run roughshod over something that was emerging. And I would say, you should have stopped a long time ago because you're going to kill this thing. You're taking all the spontaneity out of it. You're not listening to what it wants to be. And so that became sort of a running gag with me and my students.
Oh, you mean that they were going through this process and they were interacting with the work, and something new and surprising was emerging, but they weren't so familiar with the dialogue. Maybe they weren't comfortable with it. So they tried to squash the thing that was emerging, right?
Either that or they weren't listening. They didn't realize the thing had made itself in front of them because they had an idea of what they wanted it to be. And so they were working toward what they wanted it to be rather than what the painting wanted to be. And the problem of overworking, especially for painters, is a big one. If you are working with an old master technique and your main objective is to capture the verisimilitude of the thing you're painting, that's one thing. You can keep refining and refining and refining. But with other kinds of painting, especially images that maybe are working toward more psychological impact than simply trying to reflect the world, it's really critical that a student listen to the painting and know when the painting has completed itself. That someone, I think it was Aragon, who was interviewing Matisse, because Matisse was famous for working on things over long periods of time. And he asked Matisse, when do you know a painting is finished? And he said, when it's been on my wall for 3 months and I haven't felt the need to do anything more to it, which was another way of saying when the painting has decided that it's complete. And one of the things I still find remarkable in Matisse is I look at some of his paintings and I say, how the hell did he know to stop there, to stop at that point? Because anyone else looking at it would say the painting is unfinished. And yet Matisse knew when the thing had come into a state of complete being, and he knew when to stop. And knowing when to stop as a painter is one of the critical lessons one has to learn. And that takes time. That takes ruining a lot of paintings first before you allow yourself to let the thing be something different from what you thought you were going to turn it into.
As a successful artist yourself, you've gotten to this point where you can recognize this in your own work. When you go to a museum or when you look at another painter's work, can you see in another painter's work, can you see that, yes, this is finished? Or do you sometimes see, oh, yeah, I can tell that painter went on too long and they should have stopped sooner? Can you see that in another artist's work?
I think so. And I think that critics and curators can see it too, which is why if you're in a museum, you don't have that reaction very often. These are paintings which have stood the test of time. They're paintings which people have agreed came into their full state of being, if you will. I think that, in terms of myself, I've had to learn certain tricks to keep myself from ruining something I was working on. There is one thing I do is if I'm working on something and I'm unsure of where it is, I just leave the studio and I leave it alone for a while. And I then walk into the studio and turn on the lights and I look directly at the painting, and that feeling I have in the first 3 to 5 seconds tells me if the thing is complete or needs something more. And if I still am working on something, there's another reaction I have. Sometimes I'll make something and I'll get frustrated. And so I'll really just go after it and do things that I wouldn't do if I was being more careful. And I usually end up with something really terrifying. And so I'll take that painting and I'll put it against the wall and I won't look at it for 3 or 4 months. And then I'll take it out again and look at it. And often I've discovered that those paintings, which I have tried to ruin, have turned out to be the best paintings I've done. And I think it's because in a state of frustration and anger, I moved out of my comfort zone. And that's something that also is something students have to learn, is to constantly put themselves outside of their comfort zone. Because as long as you're in there, you're going to make something that's nice. You're going to make something that's palatable. And you're not going to make something that challenges your own sense of what a painting should be. So learning to do that is sometimes you have to make tricks for yourself, like putting the painting away. I know Howard Hodgkin, you talked about doing that. He would take a painting and put it against the wall so he couldn't see it. And he would leave it there for long periods of time and then take it out and look at it. And he would have a different reaction and decide it was finished, or perhaps he would realize he had to go back into it. But you can't second guess a painting. If a painting is complete and finished, I think you know it. And I think that people who have educated eyes know it as well when they see it.
It reminds me of something that I went through as I was writing my new book that's coming out in a few months. I would, like every other writer, work on it on this big screen on my desk.
Uh-huh.
So I got near the point where I thought it might be done. I started reading it on my cell phone, lying in bed at night as I was falling asleep. And somehow having it work for me, reading it on the cell phone, that had a power that I wasn't getting, looking at it on the computer screen.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's another one of those tricks. You have to trick yourself sometimes to find out what's working and what isn't. And changing the format is certainly one way to do it.
You talk a lot in your book about the importance of drawing, about lines, about illustration. I found when I talk to professors teaching undergraduates, a lot of them say the students have spent their whole lives on the computer. One instructor told me he had students who don't know how to hold a pencil.
Yeah.
And it's very important that they will require students to use pencil and paper, even though the students will say, well, why can't I do that, on my computer? I could do that much faster. And the professors will say, no, trust me, it's important for you to do it. So this is, I'm thinking, number 17 in your book. You say drawing is about mark making, and you say other things about the importance of the line. Is that right? You're talking about the importance of the physical act of putting a mark on paper.
Yes, absolutely. And, I was really stunned one time. I was reading an article about kids in schools, young kids, learning the keyboard before they learned how to write. And they did these studies, and I think I'm remembering the statistic right. They discovered that children who wrote down notes by hand had 29% greater retention of the material than those who simply keyboarded. And I think there's a real reason for this. One is that there is a visualization that happens when you write a word on paper and you see it, or you draw an image. But there are also other things that we don't talk about, which are the kind of relationship between the hand and the brain. The brain is directing the hand to move, but the hand is also telling the brain what it has done. And I think that there is a feedback loop there that's really critical. And there are also the sensual aspects of a piece of paper, the sensual aspects of a piece of charcoal or graphite moving over that piece of paper. We have five senses, and touch is one of them, and it's a really important one. Touching material goes straight to the brain and goes straight to, sometimes I find that just the way a pencil moves on a piece of paper lets me direct it in a different way than what I would have thought I was going to do. Uh, but I think the thing about drawing that's so important is drawing is a way of learning how to see. I used to teach drawing classes at the Metropolitan Museum and in New York, and lots of times these were students who had loved to draw their whole lives, but they were taking the opportunity to come into a great institution and draw from the masters, which was what the program was called. And you'd put them in front of a painting, and they would be copying it, and you'd come around behind and you'd say, well, look at that right arm on what you're drawing. Is that at a right angle to the body, or is it at a 30-degree angle to the body? And they would stop and they would look, and they would have the arm in the wrong place. And I would say, look at where that is. Locate that thing. Don't draw it. Just look at it. And after you've looked at it long enough so that you think you know where that object, that piece of the body is moving in space, then try to mimic it. And this process of using the drawing to reinforce the observation, that's a critical link right there. And if you don't learn to draw, you don't learn those precise correspondences. There are plenty of people. I'm going to tell a little story here because it's this. When I was in college, uh, all of the art instruction was sort of Bauhaus, modernist related. And we had this one drawing instructor who made sound sculptures. And we went to him and we said, Professor, can we bring a model into class and draw from the model? And, he acted as though we'd asked to bring the Antichrist in. And he said, no, we don't do that here. And so we organized our own life drawing class in one of our places where we all lived. And word got around and more people started coming. And one day this professor showed up. The one who wouldn't allow us to have a model and who made sound sculptures. And we all laughed and ribbed each other and said, oh, this is going to be interesting. And then he pulled out these giant sheets of paper and he started drawing, and he drew like an angel. These drawings were so extraordinarily beautiful. And we all just stopped and stared. And I thought, there's a lesson in this. He has developed this extraordinary skill, which he doesn't use in his work, but clearly feeds into it. And that's the way I feel about drawing. It's just one of those visualization tools that if you have in your tool belt, it gives you more control over finding or discovering that thing that is yours alone.
So you need to learn to draw, let's say if you're an 18-year-old and you just started in the art school and you want to go work for Pixar doing models of animated characters. So you might be saying, I don't need to learn drawing. This isn't going to be what I plan to do in my career. But you're saying, yes, even though you're going to be doing animated characters for Pixar, this ability to illustrate will make you better at that. Is that right?
Absolutely. While I was still teaching at Pratt, this whole de-skilling notion came into the curriculum. And I absolutely disagreed with that. The idea that you don't need skill to visualize things, to me, is just crazy. Drawing is just a tool. It's nothing more. But it's a tool that, as I said, feeds directly into the brain. It helps one see things better, if for no other reason. Until you can look at something, but until you try to draw it, you don't really understand it. And it's an observational tool, I guess.
And at the same time, I have interviewed some professors who say, yes, absolutely. We say, here that we don't teach technique. We don't teach technique. The professor said, yeah, we teach technique all the time in all of our classes, but it's not about the image. One professor said, I don't care what they draw. I care that they know how to think while they're drawing.
Yes, yes. I remember I was teaching, I went to give a lecture at a museum and I was asked to teach a class afterwards. And this was in a fairly provincial part of the country. So I had this group of students, none of whom were art students, and I gave them something to draw. And with various levels of success, some of them drew it. And then there was this one guy who made a drawing that was so filled with life. It bore no resemblance to the thing he was drawing, but the line was so alive and the line had so much character. And I held this drawing up for the class and I said, look at this. And they all laughed. They all thought this was funny because the drawing was not looking like the thing that they were looking at. I said, yeah, but look at the way he felt this thing. And they were very befuddled by that reaction. But sometimes drawing is just about putting your emotional response to something into a form. And when it's in that form, if you can feel it, then the drawing is working.
That story sounds like we're getting back to this ability to see. And the students didn't have that ability to see. You saw it right away, but they didn't see what you saw. Is that it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's it. That is it. But in fairness to them, I guess they had not yet absorbed the notion that a drawing is not just about reproducing what you're looking at. That is, in terms of the general audience for art, that's a big hurdle to get people beyond the point of thinking that an image has to look like something they know. There's this great thing that Charles Peirce, the American philosopher, used to do at the beginning of his lectures. He would draw a very convincing sphere on the blackboard, and he would ask his audience, "What is that?" And they would all agree it was a ball. And he would say, "No, it's not a ball. It's a drawing of a ball." A very simple distinction that is critical to understanding what art is all about. That art is a symbol language, and that what we are making are symbols that we are reading and reacting to, that the thing we make will never be the thing we're looking at. A drawing of a figure, it will never be the figure. It will always just be a symbol of the figure. And it's a very, it sounds like a very simple distinction, but it is the key to really understanding what art is all about.
That helps me understand something you said in an essay that you emailed me before our talk. It's called Nature and Painting. And here's the quotation: "The act of depiction is itself an act of abstraction."
Yes. Yeah. And I think that was Peirce's point, that all visualizations are abstractions. And this is something, when you look at Asian painting, Asian artists always understood this. They always understood that this is just a symbolic rendering, which is why they never developed perspective. And there's a great story about Mark Tobey, the abstract expressionist. He had a Chinese painter friend, and they're sitting in a cafe in Paris in the 1930s. And his Chinese friend turns to him and says, "Mark, why is it that all of you Westerners keep trying to make paintings of holes in the wall?" And and there's something about that story that just completely illustrates the difference in approach between trying to capture the trick of the eye, the trompe-l'oeil, the illusion, the fooling of the brain, as opposed to saying, here is a whole world, and the world is composed of these things, and we can depict the world and all of these things without ever having to resort to an illusion. And that's another thing that's hard. I think that's part of the learning to observe, the learning to see, is to understand how to read the symbol language of painting, the symbol language of visual art.
It's been a fascinating conversation, and we're coming to the end of our time. I'd like to ask at the end for our listeners, do you have a piece of advice you could give us, like an activity or a technique or just a way of thinking, something you could do in the next week that might enhance your creativity?
Well, one of the things that I always said to my students, that it's really important to know that all art is nothing but an act of description, whether it's a novel or whether it's a piece of music or whether it's a drawing. These things are nothing but descriptions. So learning to describe precisely is the key to making everything. And I used to make my students sit down and say, okay, I want you to write for me how to get from your room to this room, this classroom, in such a way that by reading the instructions, an unsighted person can get here without killing themselves. And they would start by saying, well, you go out the door and then you leave the dorm. And I say, well, wait a minute. Is there a staircase? Oh, yeah, there's a staircase. Yeah. Does it have a handrail? How many stairs are there to the next landing? How many flights of stairs? What direction do you go when you leave the front door? And we would keep refining this until they absolutely understood that you can't leave anything out in order to make a true description. And the same is true of a painting. And likewise, if there is information in there in the painting that isn't adding to the image, get rid of it. So this very simple exercise of just learning to describe precisely, I think, is critical to learning to think and analyze precisely.
Thank you. I think I'm going to do that myself. Well, Kit White, it's been a pleasure having you on the show today. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Keith. I enjoyed it.
I really enjoyed this conversation about the creative process of art making. Kit White touched on profound topics such as how to guide students through a process of personal discovery. In studio classes, he teaches students how to draw a line, how to draw a figure or a still life, but by teaching students how to make artworks, he helps them understand themselves. Creativity researchers are still struggling to understand the relationship between the act of painting and the mental processes that take place while you're painting. Psychologists usually focus on what's inside the mind, but this interview with Kit White shows that this is only part of the story. To understand the creative process, we need to examine the act of making. We need to analyze the dialogue between the artist and the work that's unfolding on the canvas. This is the cutting edge of creativity research. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.